Okay, so students, welcome back. It's been a truly memorable spring break. I hope you're all doing well. My apologies, I was going to try and write a note to you, but somehow my computer went down for B courses and I couldn't communicate. But Austin and Mansuk and Professor Van Bibber have communicated. So as you know, according to the syllabus today, we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Brad Roberts, who is the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. I'm going to introduce Brad in a minute. I just want to say, first of all, that after Brad's lecture and after the Q&A around 3:30, if you'll stick around, I'm going to go over some of the answers to the short answer policy questions on the midterm. And Austin will be available to answer any of your questions on the technical questions of the midterm. Okay, so that'll be after 3:30. I'll remind you again once Brad is finished. Okay, so this is a special treat for all of us, especially for me. Known Brad many years. Brad actually once worked with my son. That shows you how ancient I am. And Brad is a Stanford grad, London School of Economics, master's, and Erasmus University PhD, mostly in international relations and related subjects. He worked at the Congressional Research Service and at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and spent many years, over a dozen, I think, at Institute for Defense Analysis. And then we worked together in the Obama administration. Brad was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Weapons and Ballistic Missile Defense. And he was the lead writer and thinker on the Nuclear Posture Review and the Ballistic Missile Defense Review, and had an amazing, unique role in coordinating and consulting with all of our allies on these very important studies. After he left the government at the end of the first Obama administration, he went to Stanford, went back to his alma mater. He was at CSAC, Center for International Security and Cooperation, where he wrote this book, which has been assigned to every student on US nuclear weapons in the 21st century, the case for US nuclear weapons in the 21st century. And we'll be discussing more of that as we move along. Today, Brad is going to present some of his ideas on extended deterrence with our allies. There's nobody better qualified to do that than Brad, who's made incredible contacts in Europe and Asia with our key allies on nuclear weapons. He'll speak till about 3 or so, plus or minus, and then open it up to questions and answers. Okay, any questions from any student before we begin? Okay, over to you, Brad. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, Michael, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the kind introduction, Carl as well, and to Mansuk for keeping us all on track. I'm grateful for the opportunity. I want to be clear that I'm speaking for myself and not on behalf of the laboratory or any of its sponsors. My intention is to begin with some definitional and conceptual issues, then talk a little bit about the evolution of US extended deterrence policy from the Cold War through to today, but really to focus the bulk of the discussion on challenges that are emerging in the current environment, both military, technical, but also political, so that we can ground the discussion of extended deterrence in the past in our ongoing discussion about, so what do we make of all of this, and where should we be headed with our nuclear strategy? First of all, a definition of extended deterrence is that it's a form of protection that we provide to an ally, or anyone provides to an ally. In fact, we are the only country that extends deterrence to an ally. Russia has a couple of allies, but its commitment to deterrence on their behalf is unclear or muted. And China has an ally, North Korea, but it rather explicitly doesn't extend deterrence to North Korea. So this is a unique relationship in the current security environment, where we are the sole extender of deterrence the sole state offering protection through these kinds of means to an ally. There are two different audiences for extended deterrence. One is the prospective adversary. And to that audience, the message is supposed to be aimed at preventing aggression. And it's sometimes said deterring coercion. It's difficult to prevent somebody from issuing threats. Rather, the better verb is to negate coercion. We seek to vis-a-vis adversaries, the role of extended deterrence is to prevent aggression and negate coercion. The other audience is allies. Think of extended deterrence as a two-sided coin. On the one side is deterrence, on the other side, assurance. To our allies, we seek to assure them that their vital interests will not be jeopardized. We can't guarantee that they won't be attacked. We can't guarantee that there won't be all sorts of problems in their security environment, but extended deterrence is intended to assure them that their vital interests will not be jeopardized. The means by which we extend deterrence to others are really twofold. The first is declaratory policy and other forms of expressions of national leadership intent. Declaratory policy is expressed in nuclear posture reviews, it's expressed in presidential speeches, it's expressed in statements by senior military leadership. This is one way that we extend deterrence to others. The other is technical means. And of course, extended deterrence is most closely associated with nuclear weapons, where they play a unique continuing role. But we also use conventional means to extend deterrence. The conventional forces we deploy in support of our commitments to our allies, the ballistic missile defenses we deploy, these are in part about extending deterrence over them. A core issue with extended deterrence is its credibility. And Thomas Schelling wrote extensively about this in the early 1960s. But you know, stand back and imagine the circumstance. What we're doing here is we're putting our national life on the line for somebody else. In an era of major power and nuclear Armageddon-like conflict, is it credible to do that? To persuade an adversary that we're in fact willing to trade away a city or two or five or more in the United States in defense of an ally? Well, Schelling's answer to this was pretty hard to make credible. The only reasonable policy approach is to, quote, leave something to chance, to make it seem plausible that any aggression against an ally could, one way or another, end up in nuclear conflagration. So part of the reason we have tailored our nuclear capabilities the way we have over the decades is to reinforce the credibility of our threat, to employ them on behalf of an ally when their vital interests are in jeopardy, but ours might not be. This is why we have aircraft forward deployed in Europe that are capable of delivering nuclear weapons on behalf of an ally. And it's why we promise to have to deploy some of those aircraft and some of those weapons into Northeast Asia if ever there's an occasion where we need to make a clear and credible nuclear threat on behalf of an ally whose vital interests are at risk. So the technical means are intended there's a term of art in NATO that's the dual capable aircraft are the transatlantic link. They are there to establish the connectedness of America's nuclear deterrent, its strategic forces, and its homeland defense with the defense of an ally. This question of credibility we'll come back to. Now let's think about the failures of extended deterrence, if we might. What would failures mean? Well, it would mean allies are coerced. It could mean, of course, aggression against an ally. But what about the failures of assurance? If you've read the Europe chapter in my book, you would have come across the reference to Dennis Healey, a former British defense minister, who argued that deterring Soviet attack on the Central Front in Europe in the Cold War really didn't require a high degree of credibility, because if the Soviets got it wrong, if deterrence broke down and they went to war, they would pay a just terrible price. The credibility of the threat didn't need to be very high. He said 5% credible. But he said to assure an ally to stick with you in a non-nuclear way, that requires 95% credibility. You have to assure them that if they stay with you, the war is not going to happen and they're not going to be devastated because they're caught in the middle. So the failure of assurance is as worrisome today as failures of deterrence, because these could bring the tipping point in the nuclear proliferation puzzle that you've presumably already spoken about, or if not, will speak about, but a tipping point that causes a cascade of proliferation in one or more subregions in Northeast Asia or the Middle East, in response to a loss of confidence in the credibility of the US extended deterrent. The key point here is that extended nuclear deterrence is integral to our nuclear non-proliferation strategy. So that's a little bit of definitional and conceptual work, and I suspect largely repetitive of things you've been reading. Let me talk a little bit about the evolving policy context.
Dr. Roberts?
Mansuk.
So one of our students, Theodore, has a question. Theo, can you ask the question?
Sure.
Theodore? So his question is.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay,
Go ahead.
okay. Yeah, so my question is this. Hi, Dr. Roberts. Well, nuclear weapons have this EMP effect. So do you think tactical nuclear weapons that generate an EMP are a credible deterrent? I mean, the EMP, using the EMP effects themselves rather than the nuclear blast. And should they have a role in the overall extended deterrence strategy?
Well, we, the United States, have seen no role for EMP weapons in deterrence generally, or extended deterrence in particular. We have seen these are weapons that have real potential effects and potentially wide-ranging effects, essentially operating on our electrical grid in the same way that cyber weapons might, to compromise the functioning of the grid and to compromise other capabilities that are electronic, at least for a short period of time. In general, it's been the view of the United States that we don't need to have all the different range of technical capabilities that can possibly be designed into a nuclear weapon. We could have enhanced radiation weapons, we don't. We could have EMP weapons, we don't. We could have super high yield weapons, we don't. We could have super low yield weapons, we don't. We've seen it as necessary and sufficient to be able to credibly put at risk the things that our adversarial leaders might value in time of war over vital interests. And that doesn't require having all of those tools. We have at least one adversary in Russia that wants to do the maximum it can to lower the nuclear threshold, raise the conventional capabilities so that there's almost no gap in the middle. Our view is there should be a big gap, because if you cross the nuclear threshold, you've changed the war, you've changed what's at risk for us, you've changed what's at stake for us. And we're going to fight a different kind of war from that point forward. So in general, no, we don't see nuclear weapons, EMP weapons, as having a value for our extended deterrence commitment to our allies.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Roberts.
Thank you. So let me go on to set the second main part, to talk a little bit about the evolution of extended deterrence in US nuclear strategy. The Cold War was all about extended deterrence. The first thing we did with nuclear weapons after 1945 was extend deterrence. These weapons were deployed with bombers to air bases in Europe for the purpose of containing the Soviet Union. And the history of the 1950s and 1960s was all about how to keep this deterrent posture credible in the light of changing Soviet capabilities. There's a long and tortured history of extended deterrence in the Cold War. If you're historians, it will be of interest to you. But let me just go to the end of the Cold War, which is less distant history. Of course, it's buried in history to all of you. With the end of the Cold War came a significant change in US nuclear strategy. In the George H.W. Bush administration, the adoption of the presidential nuclear initiatives that in a matter of a few short weeks affected a very significant change on the nature and character of the US nuclear deterrent. And some of those changes related to extended deterrence. The United States brought all of the nuclear weapons home from Asia. It brought all of nuclear weapons off of US naval surface vessels. And from Europe, it withdrew over the decade 97% of the weapons that had been deployed in support of our commitment to NATO. This was a part of the peace dividend of the time and a desire to step back from the nuclear brink. The first nuclear posture review, which was done in 1994, makes only 2 mentions of extended deterrence, and only in the very basic sense of force structure decisions reflecting these commitments to reduce the numbers of weapons deployed and really essentially fold up the nuclear umbrella. The 2001 nuclear posture review by the George W. Bush administration gave a little more visibility to extended deterrence. That nuclear posture review was closely aligned with the defense strategy of the time. The defense strategy established 4 goals of defense strategy: to assure allies, assure, dissuade, deter, defeat. Assure allies, dissuade potential competitors, deter and defeat adversaries. It put assurance first, which might have just been because it was harmonious to go first rather than last. But assurance came first, and the assurance of allies came back into discussion. And this had something to do with the emergence of the North Korean the North Korean long-range missile program, its first successful test of a long-range missile in 1998, its renewal of its nuclear ambitions, and the realization that rogue states were after capabilities, the purpose of which was to decouple the United States from the defense of an ally, to try to separate us from an ally, to go back to Schelling's point, to make it clear to America that we weren't willing to trade San Francisco for Seoul. So recognizing this focus on rogue states and WMD and missile proliferation, the George W. Bush administration did put some emphasis back on extended deterrence and assurance of allies, but it didn't actually invest much time, energy, political capital there. Then came the nuclear posture review, in which Professor Nacht and I played roles. It set out 5 policy objectives, one of which was to strengthen extended deterrence. Now, there was a very careful debate at the presidential level on what verb to use there. Strengthen, preserve, maintain. I can't remember what other words were in play, but the president personally chose the word strengthen. So we were asked to come up with policy options for reducing the role of nuclear weapons in US defense strategy while strengthening extended nuclear deterrence. This was a bit of a juggling act. Now, why was President Obama so strong on this? After all, everyone remembers him for the Prague speech and his commitment to take practical steps towards the long-term goal of disarmament. Well, this has something to do with 2 phone calls he received. And I wasn't present for these phone calls, but they've been recounted to me. And they came, if you'll recall the Prague speech, April 2009. 3 weeks later, North Korea sent its thank you gift in the form of its second, I think it was, underground nuclear explosion. And the next couple of days, President Obama received 2 phone calls, one from the president of South Korea, one from the prime minister of Japan. And in my shorthand of these phone calls, the president said, well, these 2 callers said, Mr. President, lovely speech in Prague. And if there's anything we can do to be helpful on the road to zero, let us know, because it would make a big difference in our neighborhood. But on the way to Prague, on the way to zero, what are you going to do with what's left of the nuclear umbrella? Are you going to fold up what's left of the nuclear umbrella? Because if so, we're going to be stuck. And essentially, the president said, I'll get back to you. I'll conduct my nuclear posture review. And in fact, a year later, when we had finished the review and it came time to do the rollout activities, 2 telephone calls were made by the president back to those 2 leaders. So strengthen extended deterrence became a main preoccupation of the Obama administration, reflecting its commitment to an effective deterrent, but reflecting also its commitment to renewing our alliances, which had come in for some tough times under the Bush years. So one of my responsibilities was to work within the NATO structure to advance the presidential agenda. And in the NATO structure, there is a structure for such extended deterrence work. It's called the Nuclear Planning Group. This is the defense ministers meeting to discuss nuclear weapons. And the Nuclear Planning Group is supported by the NATO high-level group. And I led the US delegation to the high-level group. There was no such mechanism to talk with our allies in Northeast Asia. And in fact, historically, we had never spoken in any official way with the governments of Japan, with the government of South Korea in any way about nuclear weapons. And with the government of Japan, we only spoke about the 3 no's policy, which we can come back to. So we set up mechanisms, bilateral US-Japan, US-ROK, that provided for and continue to operate to provide for dialogue between our governments on how to strengthen and adapt extended deterrence to changing requirements. These things continue. The 2018 reviews of the Trump administration, as you probably appreciate, expressed some ambiguity on these points, as on many others. On the one hand, the National Defense Strategy, clearly led by Secretary Mattis, and the Associated Nuclear Posture Review clearly affirmed the role of allies and alliances in US military strategy and political strategy, and clearly affirmed our commitment to effective extended deterrence and nuclear deterrence. And in fact, it was a concern about the weakness of extended deterrence in Europe that led to the commitment to develop supplemental low-yield capability to reinforce regional deterrence. I would say extended deterrence also had something to do with the commitment of the administration to modernize the missile defense posture of the American homeland. On the other hand, of course, we have a president who is weakly committed to allies and whose grasp of the fundamentals of deterrence doesn't appear to be particularly robust. And I'll come back to that as well. So this is the second part of my presentation, and what I wanted to bring to you is that that extended deterrence was the central problem in our nuclear strategy, in the early and medium years of the Cold War. Then it disappeared from our strategic concerns and vocabulary, and it's crept back in. And it's crept back in because for two basic reasons. One, alliances still have a central place in the world order the United States has constructed together with them. And as long as we have allies, we will have a need to extend deterrence to them. And secondly, these allies are in the crosshairs of Russia and China and North Korea to break the regional orders that they so strongly oppose. President Putin, beginning in 2007, began to articulate his grievances against the European Security Order, and by 2014, explicitly charged that the existing order is aimed at encirclement and containment of Russia, is therefore unacceptable, and is expressed his commitment to moving towards a new security order more congenial to Russia, with a buffer zone around Russia's periphery, which implies the end, or at least the transformation of NATO to something else. China has clearly shifted its strategy towards US alliances in East Asia from grumbling tolerance of them to active hostility. And it's become much more assertive in putting pressure onto US allies when they undertake actions that Beijing conceives as inconsistent with its interests. And of course, North Korea is committed to a remaking of the order on the Korean Peninsula under its long-term leadership. So their strategies are aimed at breaking the regional orders that our alliances are there to protect, that our alliances manifest. And accordingly, our allies feel a need for assurance that the coercion that they're now subjected to will be negated, that they can afford to ignore the threats that are being made, and that the threatened aggression will simply not be seriously contemplated by the challengers because it's seen as too costly. And they want to know that we remain in the game with them. They, after all, have placed a significant bet. They have forsworn the potential. They've forsworn actual nuclear capability in exchange for a promise from us. The promise from us is that when their vital interests are at stake, we will be there. When the chips are down, we will be there. We will be willing to do what Schelling considered to be incredible. That's a big bet. And we Americans often, I think, don't understand how much confidence these allies have placed in us and how much anxiety they feel when they feel that we're becoming unreliable. So that's the second part of the presentation. Let me turn to the third to talk about emerging challenges, unless there's some point of clarification at this point. Mansuk, is there anything on the queue here?
So students, do you have any questions?
I guess one quick question. So if we're looking at like the Korean Peninsula, and say North Korea were starting to act directly hostile to South Korea, that would suggest that the US should start stepping in. But what happens if China then were to respond saying that if we were to take any action, they would support North Korea? Doesn't that seem, because China is becoming in essence a third superpower, doesn't that seem to de-incentivize the value of our protection?
Well, it makes the protection all the more important to the South Koreans, who are not able to manage the China factor on their own. We would have to judge in that circumstance whether we see the Chinese threat as credible. Is China really willing to do what it says? This is all a game of very high stakes chess. And we can expect that in a conflict like this, well, I mean, it depends on the circumstance, doesn't it? If there were a bolt out of the blue American attack on North Korea, I suspect the Chinese would come to their defense. If, on the other hand, there were a situation in which conventional provocations by the North and escalatory action to the North by the North led to US military intervention, I think the Chinese would not intervene. They would calculate their interests differently depending on the scenario. But yes, deterring a nuclear armed rogue state is different from deterring a nuclear armed major power, no doubt about it.
Thank you.
So let me turn to the third section, and then we can take the conversation in any direction people would like. Emerging challenges to extended deterrence. Well, I've given variations of this talk now for about 5 years, and every year this list gets longer. And that's a sorry sign of the times. But let me give you 6 emerging challenges. The first is that Russia, China, and North Korea. So the first, you've read some of the chapters in my book. So you should be familiar with theories of victory, Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. If you haven't quite gotten there yet, I'm arguing in there that North Korea, that in sequence, China, then Russia, then North Korea have developed a set of ideas about how to prosecute their interests in a regional war involving the United States and escape with some of those interests intact. I call this the theory of victory. I think it's meaningful in 2 senses in the spirit of Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. Clausewitz defined victory as that circumstance, not when you vanquish your enemy on the battlefield, but when you bring him to a culminating point, quote unquote, where the enemy chooses to no longer bear the costs and risks of continued war. The spirit of Sun Tzu is a little more obvious, to subdue your enemy without fighting. That's what these states, what these leaders hope in the gray zone, but it's in a context of crisis and war that they have ideas about how to bring us and our allies to a, quote, culminating point where we choose to no longer run the costs and risks of continued war. We don't have an answer. There is no blue theory of victory. I write in the book that there is one. I think there is one vis-a-vis rogue states, but it's been poorly elaborated. And if you don't believe me, read the report of the National Defense Strategy Commission of November 2018. This is a commission, it's a bipartisan commission. It was originally called the QDR Commission. Its function as mandated by the Congress is to review each new quadrennial defense review and issue a public report on findings and recommendations about what to do about it. And they received the 2018 National Defense Strategy of the Trump administration and said, well, it hits all the right high points, but when it comes to thinking about a war against a nuclear armed state, there is no evident thinking. There are no concepts for how to safeguard our interests. There is no doctrine. There's no appreciation of what it means to compete and deter. It was a damning indictment, and they concluded that any war against Russia and China is something the U.S. would likely lose right now. So extended deterrence can't function if you don't have an understanding of the conflict that you face, the strengths and weaknesses of your adversary, and your strengths and weaknesses. So the first emerging challenge is there's a red theory of victory, but there's not a blue theory of victory, to speak in cryptic shorthand. The second emerging challenge, also highlighted by the National Defense Strategy Commission, is our loss of conventional military advantage. Our extended deterrence posture has been a part of the two-war strategy. The United States has maintained the ability for decades to fight two simultaneous wars on the argument that if it could only fight one in one region, well, something bad would probably happen in the other region where it extends guarantees. And we have essentially disinvested in the forces necessary to do that. And we've created an expeditionary power projection-based force, and then starved it of new capability while we fought the war on terror. And they conclude that we do not have the means to prevail at the conventional level of war in a short war against Russia or China. And that the one war strategy is one that will lead to catastrophe. If you're interested in that subject, there was an excellent report of the University of Sydney US Studies Center, a guy named Ashley Townsend, which looks at which came out roughly October, which looks at the conventional military balance in the Western Pacific, and it shows China's many gains and America's many losses, and it leaves a country like Australia in deep anxiety. Third challenge, the nuclear ban treaty. The nuclear ban treaty, I'm sure in the group in the room, if you were all in a room, if we were all there together, there would be some ban treaty supporters and some ban treaty opponents. One thing we should all be able to agree about is that the ban treaty intends to go after extended nuclear deterrence first. Beatrice Finn, who won the Nobel Prize for the ICAN movement, has been explicit that ICAN's first priority at this time is to name and shame the countries that hide under the US nuclear umbrella, to change their domestic politics in a way that they come out in favor of the ban and against extended deterrence. This would have a crippling effect on US alliance commitments if it proves successful. So that was the third challenge. The fourth challenge is uncertainty and division within our alliances about how to square the effort to strengthen and adapt deterrence to meet new challenges with our ambition to improve the political relationships with Russia and China. This is really a big issue in NATO today. How does NATO continue to adapt its deterrence posture, reduce its vulnerability to Russian coercion, and still leave the door open to an improvement in the relationship with the government in Moscow? And the failure to come to agreement on these topics has blocked any further discussion of the role of missile defense in dealing with Russian regional missiles and dealing with Russian counter space capabilities. A fifth challenge relates to the rising demands in Northeast Asia for new forms of nuclear consultation. Now, I told you we have in NATO, we have the nuclear planning group and the high level group. And now in the US-Japan and US-ROK relationships, we have something like the high level group. We have people at the level that I was in the Pentagon sitting together talking about these things, making decisions. What we also have at NATO is a table where if there's ever a time that the alliance faces a choice about employing its nuclear weapons, all of the stakeholders would be at this table. It's in conference room 1 at NATO headquarters, assuming it's still standing. And they would make a choice about what recommendation to make to the American president about the employment of NATO's nuclear weapons. And there are rules governing how this consultation would work. Where is that table in East Asia? Where do Japan and South Korea sit at the table with the American president at a time when he or she is making a decision about whether or not to employ a nuclear weapon on behalf of an ally, on their behalf, when their vital interests are at stake and maybe America's aren't? Where is that table? What are the rules that would govern that consultation? There is nothing clear about those things. And at a time when South Korea and Japan both are very anxious about the nuclear threats coming from North Korea and China, we need to do better. And the final challenge is, of course, the big elephant in the room, the crisis of American credibility. To say that this is just a function of President Trump would be a gross oversimplification, but his personal policy preferences have magnified the problems for us. His obvious lack of commitment to alliances and allies, his desire to run essentially a shakedown operation to try and get them to pay more money, his hinted at intentions to withdraw from NATO, his cozy relationships with the presidents of Russia and China. All of these things simply remind our allies of how unreliable is the United States as a security guarantor. You can usually count on us to do the right thing in the end, but we may get a lot of things wrong along the way. I think every administration since the end of the Cold War, and presumably back in the Cold War as well, has done something to raise questions in the minds of allies about our commitment to their defense when our vital interests are at stake. And this tightens the anxiety of countries like Japan and Turkey, who feel that when the chips are down, maybe really America is not going to be there, and they're going to be left in a terrible situation where they're either attacked or just compelled to be an appeaser of their major power neighbor. And that's unacceptable to them. So 6 big challenges, any one of them would be tough enough, but these deserve our further analysis and thought and attention. So with that, let me hope I put enough on the table for some follow-on discussion. Mansukh, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. And so we will use this time for some free discussions and students' questions toward Dr. Roberts about his excellent book, The Case for U.S. National Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century, or any other questions regarding ongoing nuclear issues, nuclear disarmament or nuclear non-proliferation issues, or low-yield nuclear weapons and its implications. So whatever, any topics will be welcomed. Is right, sir?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. So Professor Bieber has 2 questions actually. So you go first, sir.
Okay, but the students should have priority. Let me ask and I think we are all very familiar, and I think we are, as you say, troubled by the current administration's lack of grasp of the basic concepts and what seems to be a very faint commitment to our existing alliances. On the other hand, we could be in a very different position within a year. Presumably, you've gotten to know during your time in the Obama administration, you've gotten to know at that time the Vice President, Joe Biden. You know that there's a lot of internal dynamics going on in U.S. politics, and I think there's probably going to be a lot of focus on sort of internal economics and social problems in the U.S. Could you make some prognosis of what you think a Biden administration would be doing in terms of our relationship with nuclear weapons in general and strategic deterrence in particular?
Well, I think it depends on how long Bernie stays in the race and what happens at the convention. Meaning, I think that the vice president's inclination is to build a big tent and welcome everyone within it. The Democratic Party, after all, being, you know, in Will Rogers' famous aphorism, not an organized political party. There on nuclear policy in particular, and on policy towards alliances, there are a lot of different views in the Democratic Party. And if the vice president is trying to encompass all of them in his administration, which is roughly speaking what President Obama tried to do, we will have a replay of all of the debates we had in the Obama period, and with uncertainty about how they would play out. President Obama, it turned out, had a very strong set of views, as best expressed in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, about his duties to safeguard the American people. And I mean, Biden, I'm sure, shares those values, but he has there is. I mean, he would have to balance. This is one of the many issues that a Democratic president would have to struggle with, the two different factions in the party. On the one hand, you have the moderates like me, and on the other hand, the progressives. And there are many progressives in the Democratic Party who would argue who have argued in writing, and do so in that Daedalus collection of essays, that we should not allow our interest in nuclear stability and nuclear disarmament to be hijacked by our allies. If our allies are getting in the way of doing what we need to do for nuclear disarmament and stability, well, they should get out of the way. I personally find this not right. It's an example of where the two extremes in American politics come together, converge in a way of thinking. The trashing of our allies is something that both the far left and the far right enjoy doing. So that's a response on extended deterrence. Let me say, I think there'd be also a big push on strategic stability dialogues with Russia and China. And they've made it very clear they don't want to talk. This is 10 years or more of making it clear they don't want to talk. And for us to come along to talk without having something new to say that they want to talk about seems to me to be, well, frankly, naive. And thirdly, I think I'd make two more points on nuclear modernization. I think there would be a big search for areas to spend less. But that's been done over and over and over and over and over again. And I don't know where, but some choice would be made to do less. And lastly, on nuclear arms control, of course, there'd be a renewal of high-level focus on and interest in nuclear arms control. In shorthand here, my view is that we can all agree that New START extension would be a good thing. We have no idea about what we think should come next. And New START extension is just a strategy for buying time. If we don't know what we're buying time for, well, we've not really accomplished much. So I basically see a Biden administration's nuclear policy and strategy following pretty closely in the spirit of the Obama period. And it would struggle again with all of the main big questions that one struggles with. And I suspect it would come out a little more progressively in a few points than Obama was willing to do.
Great. Thank you very much. Mansook, let me give a little space here if there are any other questions from students.
Good to go, sir.
Okay,
Dr.
go ahead. Here's somebody. Go ahead.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Roberts. Thank you for your talk. I have a question on the use of deterrence against terror. So, how important is deterrence in the fight to terror, considering that most of the terrorist organizations have subtle links with not only one but maybe multiple countries? And so, how can expanded deterrence help allies in defending themselves from terrorism?
The short answer is not much. From nuclear terrorism, it may have some role. Well, I think now 4 presidential administrations in a row have used the same language to say that someone's got their mic on there, so if you could double check on muting. 4 presidential administrations in a row have said that it's the policy of the United States that any sponsor of WMD terrorism will be held accountable as much as the perpetrator of the act. And the ability to retaliate by nuclear means, if a nuclear weapon went off in Manhattan tomorrow and its origin were traced to Iran, there would be some terrible consequence for Iran to pay, for example, or North Korea or Russia or China for that matter. But principally, extended deterrence doesn't have much impact on deterring terrorism or even mass casualty terrorism. And as you know, if you study this field, that mostly the people talk about deterrence by denial of terrorism, that you deny them access to targets and means, and they choose other targets and other means. I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification. To deter terrorism, well, let me put it this way. To commit an act of terrorism requires a village. Most of you are too young to remember a book that Hillary Clinton wrote about raising children, which said it takes a village, that it's not just parents who raise a child, but it's a whole community. Everybody's a part, teachers, parents of other children, etc. An act of terrorism requires the terrorist, but all of the many people and processes that enable that act. The provider of the safe house, the provider of the documents, the provider of the weapons, the provider of safe exit, safe haven, the training, et cetera, et cetera. And those people are not people who have chosen to give their lives to the cause. And thus they can be held accountable and put at risk in ways that suicide bombers cannot. And lastly, let me say about perpetrators of terrorism, we're very focused on the undeterrability of suicide bombers. The 1 year for which I have data is 2003. And in 2003, there were something like 40,000 acts of terrorism around the globe. And of those, only 2% resulted in the death of the perpetrator at the hands of the perpetrator. So suicide terrorism is not the preferred form of terrorism either. So I think there's a discussion to be had about deterrence and terrorism that we've not so far had, but it's not a discussion about extended deterrence.
Okay, thank you. Will James ask his question, then we'll turn to Maxwell, then we'll go back to Professor Bieber. James, go ahead.
Okay, so I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about what the implications of the most recent missile tests by Korea and how that's Japan and South Korea obviously have been upset by this, and how that impacts our response to North Korea, because I haven't seen much of a response. And so I'm wondering how we're portraying ourselves in this defensive posture for them.
Dr. Roberts, if you don't mind, may I add some questions to James's question?
You always ask hard questions, Mansuk. I'm not sure I said say yes, but go ahead.
Yeah. So building on James's point, it seems like North Korea is turning to developing some A2AD capability rather than sticking to intercontinental ballast missiles, which seemingly North Korea failed in 2017. So how would such North Korea's A2AD anti-denial and area access capability influence and affect U.S. extended deterrence capability on the Korean Peninsula and toward Japan?
Right. Well, I think these shorter range missile launches are very much about creating the impression in the minds of the United States and our two allies in the region that our naval forces would be vulnerable in a war against North Korea. I think also they're generally the absence of the testing of long range systems, I believe, is seen generally in Washington as proof that talking tough worked, and that the North Korean leader is not willing to risk a strong reaction from the United States with a provocation at that level, in intercontinental range missile test, and that instead he's fallen back on lesser capabilities and thus looks weaker in the minds of interested stakeholders in Washington. I'm not sure that's the right assessment, but it's the assessment I hear people making. It is, and the absence of a strong military response from the United States, I think, is, it means we're back to the game of strategic patience, which was the policy of the Obama administration, which was, we're not going to allow this guy to keep jerking our chain at every moment and opportunity and always react to everything he does, because that means the initiative is his. We want the initiative to be ours. And I think that's the right approach. We shouldn't let ourselves be in a reactive mode all of the time. And thus we should choose to ignore some of the provocations. But at a certain point, there needs to be a stiff response. Can North Korea assemble a robust anti-access area denial capability? Well, it can build a lot of rockets. Are they able to, would they be able in time of war to track aircraft carriers and other vessels that are in motion on over the horizon? I don't think so. And even if they were able to do so, would they have the volume, the number of weapons to sustain attack on arriving American forces? I think not. So my view is this is mostly for show. That answer your questions, you guys?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, who's up next?
Max Wallace.
Hi, Dr. Roberts. I wanted to ask you about some actions that could be taken by the U.S. to bolster the enhanced deterrence agreements in, shall we say, the after this presidential reluctance period ends. I'm thinking maybe bringing forward dual capable aircraft deployments to Europe, or like a Reforger or Able Archer exercise, or something of that nature that would help reinforce our allies.
Well, it would begin with clear political signals. And I think as one person put it, we need to retake our, we need to, like a married couple that's been through a midlife crisis, we need to take our vows again. We need to remake our vows. And that means the next American president going to allied capitals. It means the American president investing political capital in these relationships, and not just with a single visit, but with cabinet level consistent engagement and active presidential engagement with these allies over the term of office. That's the beginning point. Then there are practical agendas of cooperation activities, and at NATO, I would begin with a review of NATO last issued its strategic concept, which is roughly a 100-paragraph statement of its view of the world and its role in the world and its functions and problems and agenda. The strategic concept now in place was signed in 2010, and the world has changed a lot since then. And NATO's deterrence posture was studied and endorsed in the Deterrence and Defense Posture Review of 2012. It would be very productive for the alliance to undertake both of these reviews. Now, that's not the same thing as conducting a reforger exercise or deploying new capability, but I think putting our intellectual houses in order about the security problems in front of these alliances is the key to renewing them. Capabilities, we got a lot of capability, actually. It may not be that we're missing capability. It may be that what we're missing is, well, a blue theory of victory. And similarly with Northeast Asia, well, I would like to see some substantial institutionalization of a nuclear consultation mechanism. And I would like to see a demonstration of the ability of the United States to do what it says it's committed to doing, which is to being ready to deploy dual capable aircraft into the region for the delivery of nuclear weapons in time of crisis and war. We say that we have that, but we haven't demonstrated it, and demonstrating it would make a positive difference. Let me offer one other comment, and that's that the way we've thought about extended deterrence historically, the way I began is, here's our gift to you, that extended deterrence is something the United States provides to others. We're moving into an environment in which this is something we do together with our allies. Deterrence is a shared activity. Deterrence results from cooperation between the United States and its allies, among them. And this evolutionary step has been taken in the US-Japan alliance, which now Japan speaks explicitly about the deterrence values of the alliance as such, and the ways in which Japan contributes to the extended nuclear deterrent of the United States by addressing some of the related conventional and missile defense requirements. So I think the more we shift the vocabulary with our dialogue with our allies to being about joint activities to deter and extend deterrence, the better off we're going to be. Who's up next?
Then we have Professor Bieber's question, then Andrew's question.
Okay, thank you, Brad. Let me just build a little bit on your comment there, because I think it's exactly right that deterrence is strategic deterrence is a shared lift. It's a commitment. Compared to the world of some decades ago, we live in a world that's much more sophisticated, and adversaries such as China and Russia, I think, understand very well that there are many ways to sort of undermine these strategic alliances. They can be cultural, they can be economic, they can extend into the world of sort of IT, information technology, political, and so forth. And I think one of the things that I find I'm somewhat mystified by, and I think a little troubled by, is the fact that our allies, both in Asia and in Europe, I think sometimes miss the point that I think the strength of these alliances can extend to very practical things, such as, if one needs natural gas, you can either you can either agree to receive a pipeline from Russia versus take it from the U.S. It extends to issues of the security of 5G technology. Now, I'm not an expert on the real or perceived sort of intelligence vulnerabilities of Huawei technology, but it seems to me that part and parcel of this marriage compact would be for our allies in the U.S. to actually take to really be in lockstep on these other things, which in the long run can actually undermine the security of these alliances. So, do you want to comment on this sort of broader picture of cooperation in these other spheres?
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and it reminds me of why I always try to emphasize that the nuclear part of extended deterrence is about threats to vital interests, and there are all sorts of other threats that aren't to vital interests for which nuclear weapons are irrelevant. Mm-hmm. And I leave that part of the conversation out, but it's in some sense the most fundamental part. If President Putin if he's indeed committed to breaking the European security order, he's interested in driving a wedge between the United States and our allies. And if we're not able to cooperate on all of the many shared interests we have, then he's going to perceive many places to put that wedge. And but I think I think our allies are occasionally unmindful of what they need to do to cooperate. But we've put them in the position more and more of needing to hedge their bets. As you know, Carl, the classic book on U.S. alliances is about being trapped between between entrapment and abandonment. Mm-hmm. They're worried about getting caught up in big projects of America that we then drop at the next corner, or being abandoned along the way, and they need to hedge against both possibilities. And it seems to me if we want different behaviors out of them, it's incumbent upon us. And we fundamentally have not answered in an enduring political way the question, how much are we willing to count on allies for our defense? We are deeply ambivalent about allies having strike capabilities. South Korea's pursuit of a regional range ballistic missile with a conventional warhead deeply troubled the Obama administration. Japan's push for conventional strike capabilities of its own, we're unhappy with, generally speaking. We've refused to export the Tomahawk cruise missile to anybody but the British. We are ambivalent about our allies. We don't want to count on them, but we don't want them to run away. And thus, it seems to me, we get the hedging behavior from them that we object to.
Thanks. That gives a much fuller picture and a more balanced picture. Thanks very much, Brad.
Thank you. Who's up next?
Andrew, it's your turn.
All right. Hi, Dr. Roberts. So my question goes back to when I was a wee little kid in middle school, when I was learning about World War I from history class for the very first time. One of the bolded words listed as a cause for World War I was alliances. Now, if we were to go and use our naive knowledge of World War I history and assume that alliances caused World War I, what fundamentally is required of an alliance to make sure that's effective in ensuring a period of relative peace, rather than one that is potentially a failed alliance that could potentially spur the cause of like World War III?
Well, that's an interesting question. The World War I reference, I assume, was to the argument that once the ball started rolling, no one could afford to stand aside, and everybody's interlocking plans unfolded, and the war occurred that nobody really wanted. We do worry about our allies. This is our reluctance for our allies having strike capabilities of their own. We worry about our allies dragging us into conflicts and then counting on us to get them out of the corner they've painted all of us into. As one ally put it, one non-official ally put it in a conference I once participated in, he said, "We count on you Americans to come along as the nuclear executioner." And I said, "Boy, then you're making a mistake. We're not going to come along and kill a whole lot of people with nuclear weapons for the second time in history because you decided to fight a war that you weren't sure you could win and you dragged us into to clean up the mess." This is part of our ambivalence about alliances, is that capacity for independent action. It's why we oppose the nuclear programs of the French and the British, particularly the French. Now, the reality is, speaking practically, well, what are our alternatives? Our alternative today is to walk away from our alliances, which would produce, in my view, a whole new range of problems that no one anticipated and that would make our security worse. What's the other alternative? Well, it's to stay with alliances, but let them become more and more hollow, which just kicks the problem down the road to a later time when we'll discover that they're unreliable in some shocking incident. So I'm of the view that we should maintain our alliances and do what's needed to make sure they're credible and to make sure they're based on close political cooperation so that nobody's surprised by strategic behavior by any of the allies, including the United States. I'm not sure that answers the question you asked. Does it come close?
Yep, it works well for me. Thanks.
So actually, no one in the queue now. So
Mansuk, I have a question. Michael here. Do you hear me, Mansuk?
yeah,
Can I ask a question of Dr. Roberts?
sure, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. I don't have the video at the moment, but so Brad, on Wednesday, Cheryl Hingorani is going to speak on central deterrence, primarily deterrence against Russia and China. And of course, she's now assistant to the director of the lab, Bill Goldstein. And one of the lab's new programs, which I think she'll address, is the new low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile warhead that was called for by Trump. So putting aside its role in central deterrence, what about for extended deterrence? If the US moves ahead with the deployment of low-yield SLBMs, does that strengthen or weaken or have no impact on our allies?
Well, first of all, there's no if. The low yield ballistic, the low yield option for a ballistic missile aboard a submarine has already been deployed.
Okay.
That was a 1-year activity that was doable very quickly. My view is that's all about extended deterrence, not central deterrence. If there were a major nuclear war with Russia involving the exchange of strategic forces, having a low yield option really adds nothing to our toolkit. And the value of the supplemental capability is in an extended deterrence role. And the case that's usually made that you're familiar with, I know, is the case that we worry that President Putin may calculate that he can use a low yield weapon or a few of them in Europe, and we have no good low yield retaliatory option. We have to resort to a large scale attack on Russia. The threat to do that is incredible, therefore he's not deterred. Therefore,
Right.
to raise the nuclear threshold rather than lower it, we needed some new low yield option in Europe. I think that's a plausible argument. I'm not particularly persuaded by it because I don't think President Putin sits at his desk and thinks, well, those Americans, they've got a 100 kiloton weapon, but not a 97 kiloton weapon. Therefore, therefore I can do this. I don't think that's how he thinks. But I was a supporter of the program because in my view, he's watched NATO do nothing over a 12-year period in which there's been a massive buildup of Russia's ability to bring war to NATO. And I don't just mean with nuclear weapons, but certainly with nuclear weapons. But missiles, let's see, the Minister of Defense of Russia last month gave an update on the latest 5-year plan in which he said something like the number of deployed delivery systems, all dual capable, the number of new deployed delivery systems, so aircraft, missiles, submarines, and naval surface combatants, has increased by a factor of 30. And this is while Russia has, and all of these delivery systems are designed to be capable of delivering either a conventional or a nuclear weapon. NATO's done nothing in response. If I were President Putin, I'd say, these guys don't have any resolve. They're not doing anything seriously to redress the imbalance that I, President Putin, have created. I think the alliance needed to do something, and the alliance can't do anything. The alliance is gridlocked on these issues, as you know. And therefore, it needed to fall to one of the 3 nuclear armed members of the alliance to do something. And it wasn't going to be the British or the French. So I think there is a signaling value to the willingness of the United States to deploy a supplemental capability. It was in very small numbers. Its likelihood of ever being employed is as low as any other likelihood of any other nuclear weapon being employed. But I think it was the right move.
Got it. Thank you very much. I think we're about out of time. Are there any more queries in the queue, Mansuk?
No more questions in the queue.
Okay. Okay, then. Well, any final words, Dr. Roberts? Or
No, I want to congratulate everybody on their interest in the nuclear subject, and the 2 of you for, again, investing all of the energy and time in this course. It's a starry sign of the times that we need to be engaged on these topics. But I'm glad everybody is. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. We'll have you back next year.
terrific presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts.
Thank you.
Dr. Roberts.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Hear from you. Bye-bye.
Now, students, are you still there?
Yes, I'm gonna share our, we cannot share actually.
Problem?
Oh, that's the problem. So I don't have any right to share my slides or my screen. So students, do you have the midterm exam paper in your computer?
It's okay, I can go over the questions orally.
Yes, sir.
They don't need that. Shall I just proceed? So I'm
Yes,
gonna
yeah.
just quickly go over some of the plausible answers to the policy questions and then turn it over to Austin, who will take any questions you have on the technical answers, okay? So on the policy side, there were 5 questions. You had to choose 3. The first had 5 short questions contrasting each of the following. The first one was massive retaliation versus assured destruction. Massive retaliation was the dullest declaratory policy about a massive attack against the Soviet Union if they had even a minor initial attack, and it was viewed as non-credible. It was later replaced by assured destruction with McNamara, where he said, we want to be able, if necessary, to destroy a substantial amount of Russia's military and civilian and industrial capability in the event of a Soviet initial nuclear attack. Deterrence versus compellence. To deter is have the will and capability to persuade someone from doing something they were planning to do but haven't done yet. And compellence is having the will and capability to persuade someone to stop doing something that they're already doing. A great example of both is in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where deterrence about to deter use of the Soviet missiles in the Western Hemisphere, and compellence is to force them to get the missiles out of Cuba. ICBM versus SLBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, land-based, silo-based missiles on the ground. SLBM, submarine-launched ballistic missiles on board are nuclear.
Michael, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but you kind of cut out and your screen is frozen. I think there might be internet problems.
Oops. Are you back? Okay, great.
We can hear you again.
Austin, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
You seem to be cutting in and out a bit.
Okay. I can hear you. I didn't know.
I think your internet is having issues.
Mhm.
You keep cutting in and out.
Can you hear me? Should I move on to the second question, or am I not audible?
You can probably move on now. You seem to be back in for the moment.
Okay. So determine which of the following statements are true or false is question 2. Did US physicists play a leading role in the discovery of the atomic nucleus and nuclear fission? The answer is no, it's false, they did not. Was Brody a proponent of a low yield nuclear weapon as a credible deterrent? The answer was no, that's false. Did Reagan and Gorbachev agree to limit Soviet and US ballistic missile defenses by signing the ABM treaty? No, that's false. So the first 3 are false. SALT II never entered into force because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. That's true. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, the UN had dual objectives, deterrence and compellence. That's true. Can you hear me okay? Am I understandable?
You're sounding good now.
Yeah.
Evaluate Truman. This is question 3. His major decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I don't have time to go through all the strategic, military, political, technological, and ethical consequences. Obviously, key point was Truman was under tremendous pressure to end the war, and he couldn't imagine the consequences if he had a weapon that could end the war and he didn't use it. And he was much more motivated by that than understanding the true significance of unleashing nuclear bombs. Question 4, Wolsted's breakthrough idea that the nuclear balance was very delicate was criticized by Brody, Bundy, and Warnke. What do you think of Wolsted's idea? I think, the jury's still out because we never really fully understood the Soviet intent and capability. but clearly we never had nuclear weapon use in the 40-odd years of the Cold War. So maybe it wasn't quite as delicate as Wohlstetter had suspected. And 5, on the NPT, major international legal instrument. But now we've got a second nuclear age with regional powers. Do you think that there are any measures that US can adopt to include an NPT modification to reduce the likelihood of nuclear weapon use? You know, we're trying to bolster the safeguards and verification capabilities of states through the IAEA that George Moore talked about. And the US is exerting a lot of pressure on nuclear aspirants like Saudi Arabia and Turkey and others not to go ahead with nuclear weapons. So those are some of the answers to some of the questions on the policy side. Any questions about these from the students? Mansuk, any questions from the students?
No, no questions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, class. I'll turn it over to Austin. And Wednesday, we'll have another guest lecture, Cheryl Karani from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Thank you. Okay, Austin.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
So for the technical side of the midterm, the solution set is up on B courses for you to look through, but I am happy to answer any questions you might have on any of it here and now. All right, then, if there's no questions, feel free to reach out to me with email or whatever you want if you come up with any questions you'd like me to ask later. And that'll be all for today. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons.
Thank you, Austin.
Thanks, Mansuk.
Yeah.